Military historian Victor Davis Hanson's new book is Carnage and Culture, which examines why Western civilizations have such successful militaries. Mr. Hanson also addresses the terrorist attack on the U.S. and discusses them in the context of the themes in his book. It's 70 minutes.
I'd like to welcome everyone. I'm Kathy Lamonsky, and I want to welcome you all to Fig Garden Bookstore. We're especially honored today to have C-SPAN's Book TV joining us in Fresno as we welcome Victor Davis Hanson back to our store. Dr. Hanson is a professor of classics at California State University, Fresno. He's been a visiting professor of classics at Stanford University and will be a visiting professor of military history at the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland in the 2002-2003 school year. He's the author and editor of 11 books and currently lives and works on his family farm near Selma. His latest book, Carnage and Culture, Landmark Battles in the Rise of Western Power, was published by Doubleday in August of 2001. Fig Garden Bookstore in Fresno welcomes Victor Davis Hanson.
Thank you. Very glad to be here. Maybe if some of the students in the back there would like to sit down over here, there's a space. You could just walk. I don't think you'll disturb me as I talk. Very happy to be here. You know, I speak a lot out of state, and I'm always reminded when I come back to the San Joaquin Valley how much better sense people have in the San Joaquin Valley than most of the universities I speak at, so it's especially a treat for me. In the past, if I've done this, I had given a synopsis of the book for 30 minutes. I don't think that's appropriate given the situation that we've had in our country. So what I would like to suggest is I would shorten that synopsis from 30 minutes only maybe to 5 or 10 in the sense of how this particular book, which came out 3 weeks ago, relates to the current crisis, because I think it does. And then I would like to just go over what I would call 5 or 10 mythologies about this current crisis that I've been hearing on television and in the popular media, and try to give you a historical context that might refute those. But most importantly, I want to hear what you have to say, and then we could have a question and answer period, and I'll try to get as many people to ask questions as possible. I wrote this book because I didn't see an explanation for what I read on the page. When I had read Greek and Latin literature, or medieval literature, or Renaissance literature, a constant theme came back. The 10,000 Greeks who in 401 were mercenaries and attacked with Cyrus the Younger at the Battle of Cunaxa, lost 1 person wounded, then battled themselves out of Central Asia, and they saved 3/4 of their troops. At the Battle of Marathon, the Greeks lost 192 people and killed 6,400. The biggest problem for Alexander the Great at the Battle of Gaugamela, which may have been the biggest battle in the ancient world, was getting rid of the corpses after the battle. He lost almost nobody and slew over 50,000. We talk about the medieval period being a nadir in Western culture, but in fact, other than earlier Xerxes' brief incursion, the Moors in southern Spain, some Ottoman incursion into Eastern Europe, Europe was essentially free throughout the medieval and Renaissance period. And by the 19th century, 85% of the world's surface was controlled by European forces. Now, this is something that we either try, most of us in the mainstream academic business, either try to deny or apologize for. And I didn't want to write a book trying to talk about the justice or injustice of Western culture. I simply wanted to explain why it was so. Why do Europeans today and Americans project power that's not commensurate with a rather small population and territory? Why is it that China steals secrets from us and we don't steal them from China? Why do we project power overseas and in a way that's not common elsewhere? And so I wrote this book to try to identify 8 or 9 characteristics of Western culture that, when applied to the battlefield, historically, over 2,500 years, have given the Europeans and their culture power that was not commensurate with its population. It's very unpopular because people who have seen this phenomena try to explain it in different ways. And I expect probably to be severely criticized for this view that it was a unique cultural tradition that explains that dynamism. There's a very popular explanation that says it's guns, germs, and steel, as if it was an accident of history that Europe became so prominent. But my gosh, Mycenaean Greece was not a powerful culture. And yet, a mere 500 years later, people who spoke the same language, who lived in the same environment, projected power all over the Mediterranean. The pharaohs of Egypt were not able to project power over the Mediterranean, but once, and we were told that they declined when their soil was exhausted. Yet the Ptolemaic Greeks who took over Egypt in the same soil were able to create a civilization, moving, of course, the capital from Karnak to Alexandria, that was quite dynamic. So I would argue that this phenomenon is accountable by culture, and the culture did not exist before Greece in the 7th and through 5th century, and not elsewhere. What is this culture? Freedom, of course. The Battle of Salamis, the Greeks were extremely outnumbered. It might have been the greatest single-day battle in the history of civilization, and yet they killed over 60,000 Persians. If you've been to Salamis and you look at that strait, imagining those bodies, it must have been horrendous. They lost almost no one. Why? Well, for a variety of other reasons, technology, of course, but the Greeks believed it was freedom. And Aristotle has an interesting discussion about what free people can do, and that's going to be tested in the next year or two. We're told that fanaticism is a great advantage in war, but history tells us the opposite, that free people who willingly take up arms, slow to wrath, actually last the distance. Another decisive characteristic of Western battle is something this term called civic militarism, that soldiers in the West have rights and responsibilities. You know, after the Battle of Cannae in 216 BC, that capped a 24-month period in which over 100,000 Romans were killed on the battlefield by Carthaginians. And yet, within 8 months after that battle, there were more Romans in the legions than there were Carthaginians. In other words, a Western country was able to draft people, give them rights and responsibilities, and create a bigger army than professional mercenaries. Same was true after the Battle of Midway. We were told that the United States could not fight Japan because we only had 3 carriers. By 1944, we had over 70, and Japan had less than when they started with. Civic militarism is a uniquely Western idea, and it's quite lethal when applied to the battlefield. Decisive battle, Westerners like to engage the enemy frontally. There's some Westerners, of course, who, from Francis Marion to Nathan Bedford Forrest, who haven't done that. I'm not suggesting it's always true. But we have this propensity to bring forces to a focus. And although we will fight a different type of war this time, there will be occasions when we will harness that power of infantry and air power, and it will be overwhelmingly devastating. It always has been in the history of the world. That's why Herodotus' Mardonius said the Greeks make war in a very strange way. They bring everybody together and they annihilate each other. And that's true. Another, of course, is technology. It's not an accident that people steal arms from the West. It's not an accident that gunpowder, while it had been invented in China, was among the Mandarins, was not used in a practical way. Only in the West did people try to write treatises on it, fabricate it, compete with each other, and flood the world with firearms. Why? Because we in the West have this strange amoral tradition of divorcing knowledge from religion. Somebody's always going to try to beat somebody. And when you marry that with another characteristic, capitalism, free markets, which begin in Greece, then you have the ability not only to develop new weapons, but to fabricate them beyond your wildest dreams. The Battle of Lepanto, for example, a single Western state, Venice, with a population of less than 200,000 people, could create more galleys in a single year than the Ottomans could, who had a population of 35 million and perhaps 1 million square miles of territory. In fact, the arsenal at Istanbul, and you can see it today, some of the remains, is a duplicate of the one at Venice. After the battle was over, the Westerners who had won at Lepanto simply scrapped the cannon from the Ottomans. It was substandard. And they won that battle over overwhelming odds. Another tradition is this weird idea of Western discipline. No, everywhere else in the world, and Aristotle tells us this in the Politics, people reward soldiers for killing people. They have rewards for how many kills, or how many prisoners you take, or how well you are with a sword. In the West, discipline is defined by marching in rank, keeping in time, drill, keeping your position, advancing on orders, and retreating. A good example, and one that I discuss at length in the book, is Rorke's Drift in the Zulu War of 1879. Less than 100 active, able-bodied British soldiers held off over 4,000 Zulus. And when the carnage was over, they lost less than 20, and they killed 400 and wounded as many. It wasn't because the Zulus didn't have weapons. They had been importing weapons for 60 years, and the night before they had surprised the British at Islawanda, and they had hundreds of Martini Henry rifles that were excellent. But they had a different idea of how to use firearms, individually, without training, without control, without volleys. British redcoats fired, kneeled, and were able to have a discipline that goes all the way back on a continuous tradition to the Greek phalanx. So we in the West, and I think you'll see that again in the next, we talk about fanaticism and these cells as being disciplined. They will not have the discipline of the 101st Airborne, believe me. They will not do it. And I don't say that with any sense of chauvinism at all. It's just a historical fact. And finally, and one of the chief and most controversial chapters is Vietnam. And I try to look at, as well as Western defeats, Western losses, and I look at Tet in that context. There's an idea of civic audit or civic control over military operations and free speech and dissent, which you'd think would have the opposite effect, but in fact focuses Western policy, strategy, and tactics by inclusive debate. And I think that's very valuable. Much of what you heard is about our weakness, and of course we do seem weak in the last week, but I think that the real danger for the rest of the world has always been the West. We're much stronger than we think we are. Only our adversaries appreciate that. And the history of 2,500 years of civilization is mostly a question of where the West wants to fight and under what conditions. And this system that I've talked about has allowed Western armies to project power into Asia, the Americas, whether we're talking about Hernan Cortez. Remember when Cortez invaded Mexico, he had less than 1,500 men. 2 years later, he destroyed an empire of 4 million. It's not true that they didn't have natural resources, the Aztec Empire. Within a 10-mile radius of Tenochtitlan, there was all the ingredients for gunpowder that laid under the soil and were not utilized. A year after Cortez landed, they were not only creating gunpowder, but they were also casting cannon within 2 years. And that's typical of Western. It has nothing to do with morality. It's a question of dynamism. But in any case, this system has allowed the West to trump the usual factors that determine success or failure in the battlefield. And what are they? Weather, numbers, logistics, distance. It means that you can have a bad day against Hannibal, military genius. Actually, 3 bad days if you count Trasimene and Trebia and Kenai, and still win. You can be halfway around the world like Hernan Cortez, and yet at Veracruz on the coast, there will be more logistical support for him than there will be for the Aztecs at Tenochtitlan. And the only frightening thing about this, and I'll conclude here and we'll go to the contemporary affairs and how this relates to it, is if you want to look at real carnage, you have to look at what happens when this system turns on itself. The Greeks killed in one battle, the Peloponnesian War, more people than they lost against the Persians. If you want to talk about the great killer of Greeks, it was not Persia in the 4th century, it was Alexander the Great. He killed over 40,000 Greeks that were serving for the Persians. He was not worried about Persians, he was scared stiff of his own people. Same thing is true, as you know, in the wars in Europe in the 18th and 19th century. Europeans kill each other at a greater rate than any Ottomans or Islamic troops killed Westerners. And the 20th century is the story of Western carnage. So we in the West have this great burden. It's not that we should feel weak. We're very strong. We have to be very careful that we don't commit mutual suicide against another Western power. History's not static. Until this crisis, there were certain things in the world that were disturbing. Fractions among Western culture, the rise of the EU and the jealousy and envy against the United States. The idea that some countries like China could become westernized, at least in some cases. And so the Western way of war is deadly, and it can be catastrophic when turned on itself. This is just a preface to the contemporary crisis that we are in, and I'd like to apply some of the things that I wrote about to the events that occurred on Tuesday, and then we'll open it up for questions. The first myth, I think, is that this was a terrorist act. This was an act of war, and we only say that, not out of pride or saber rattling, but through historical comparison. We don't know how many people have been killed in the World Trade Center. We know a little bit more about the Pentagon. I was surprised, however, that our reporters keep going down to hospitals and saying the bodies haven't come in yet. Well, the bodies haven't come in, as sad and tragic it is, because they've been vaporized. We had a temperature in those buildings of about 2,500 to 2,700 degrees. And the dust cloud is what, that dust cloud wasn't just gypsum board and cement, it was Americans, and there's not going to be bodies. And this idea that we might have 4,000 dead, it could vastly exceed that. And that brings up what's happened in American history. We went to war at Pearl Harbor because 2,400 Americans were killed. We went to war in World War I partly because of the sinking of the Lusitania a few months earlier, but there was less than 1,000 Americans killed. Spanish-American War started with far less killed. Civil War, Fort Sumner, was almost nobody killed, and the North went to war. So this idea that this is just a single incursion, the two greatest symbols of American power, military power being the Pentagon, economic power being the World Trade Center, have been devastated. So by any fair standard of history, we're not in a terrorist situation at all. We're in an act of war. Which brings us to the next question. This, if I could use this hyperbole, this insane notion that we're somehow going to conduct a legal investigation and then indict these people and bring them to justice. It would be as almost, well, it would be as if after your fathers and grandfathers woke up on December 8th, and my God, they would ask to bring the Japanese pilots to trial. We would offer them lawyers, and then we would try to conduct this as if it was an investigation. Instead, they got up and declared war. Very different attitude. So this is not a terrorist incursion. It's not something for the legal system. Another mythology is that the Islamic world and the Arab world are very strong. The fact is we're probably seeing them in their weakest state since the 19th century and perhaps the 8th century. The problems in the Arab world are not Western-induced, they're self-induced, and they're a result of a failure to adopt democracy, a preference for strongmen, autocrats, and religious fundamentalism. Those things have ruined countries like Iran, like Iraq, like the Middle East, and it explains why Israel, who has a fraction of the population of the Arab countries along the coast of northern Africa, has a larger economy, or it has more military power because it's adopting these things we talked about earlier, what constitutes Westernism. And this is also very important to keep in mind. I heard a commentator say lately, well, we deserve it for what we've done to Islamic people and Islamic fundamentalism. Well, my gosh, the last 10 years, no country in the world did more to save Islamic culture in Europe than the United States. Had the United States not intervened in Eastern Europe, you may have seen the decimation of all Albanian Muslims. Europe did not act, the United States acted. That was not in our national interest. It was in our moral interest as Western people and Democrats not to let a people be exterminated. And those were fundamentalists, some of them, Islamic people. And yet, we were not given credit for that in the Islamic world. The same is true, by the way, in Russia. We've heard this false knowledge that we went into Afghanistan to manipulate people. That may or not be true, but the result of it was that Soviet totalitarianism did not destroy Afghanistan. And yet the same people we trained to resist the Russians are now killing our women and children. Another, I think, a great myth, and this has come up a lot, both people have asked me the last 2 days in the media, and it's the idea that you cannot eliminate Islamic fundamentalism. I've heard people say, well, if you were to kill them, they'd come back. And I thought to myself, what were the 4 great scourges of the 20th century? Number 1, German Nazism. That lasted about 12 years, and there's not any government today that openly adopts Nazism. It was completely destroyed by the Allied powers. Second was Italian fascism. It no longer exists. Third was Japanese militarism. It does no longer exist. The fourth was Soviet communism. The war was longer, but it no longer exists. All throughout history, every ideology can be defeated, especially one as bankrupt is Islamic fundamentalism, which cannot reconcile the fact that people like to use cell phones and charge their tickets on their way to murdering people with frequent flyer miles and American Express cards, and yet they know that their own culture cannot create those things that they want. That's weakness, it's not strength. Another mythology is that we have not engaged in a war against terror before. We have. There's nothing more terrifying than kamikazes. Nothing. And yet our fathers defeated them, even though they lost hundreds of people off of Okinawa. I don't think there's anything more terrifying than the Waffen-SS and the Battle of the Bulge. But my gosh, American soldiers not only were executed after they surrendered, they were blown apart in their trenches in the middle. Nobody said that you could not defeat these people because they were using a form of terrorism. And so I think that we have to, instead of being caught up in the therapeutic culture today, very rationally and soberly, look back through history, and I think if we do, it will give us great comfort and strength rather than this period of uncertainty. Another myth, and then I'll open it up for questioning, I think this is very important, and that is at certain points in history, there's a decisive change in culture. And I think this Tuesday will be a traumatic change in American culture. We don't know completely the ramifications, but I'd just like to touch on two, one military and one social and cultural. Military, I think it's going to change the way that the Americans look at war. And I think it's going to go back to the Western idea, which always had since the Greeks. It's not a therapeutic, but it's a tragic idea, that war is not necessarily evil. It's evil only when evil people make war against you. War can be a tool to defeat evil. The 20th century, most of the people who were killed were not killed in wars, as horrific as World War I and World War II were. Most people were German and Eastern European Jews killed by Hitler, innocent people killed by Stalin, and innocent people killed by Mao and later by the Cambodians. And we saw that in Africa recently. If you tally up those millions, perhaps 80 million, far more than were killed in World War II. We have to go back to that idea that war is tragic, but like the Greeks said, it's the father of us all. It's there, you cannot eliminate it. This idea that we've been dealing with for 20 years, that war under any circumstance is evil, only allows evil to perpetuate. And we're going to have a radical redefinition in this country of what constitutes humanity. When we have newspaper columnists saying that they pray that we don't do anything, and we've had a lot of them, well, then essentially you're saying in classical terms that the people who were vaporized didn't matter. And I don't know about you, but I can't accept that. I had a father who flew 39 missions over Japan, and my person I'm named after was killed in Okinawa. And I would hate to think that they went and fought and died and were ruined in their lives to hand over freedom that we bartered away to an Afghani thug. I just can't accept that. That's not, again, chauvinism. That's nothing to be ashamed of. That's a natural feeling among a democratic people that's existed in our culture since the Greeks. So we're going to see a radical change in the way we look at war. We're also going to see a changing of the guard. 1860, nobody knew who Ulysses S. Grant was. He was a grocer. George McClellan was a railroad president that made $10,000 a year. Sherman had been a failed everything. Nathan Bedford Forrest was he was probably a thug. Nobody thought he had any talent at all. And yet in the crucible of war, they came forward as real talent. Same thing with George Patton in World War II, same thing with Pershing in World War I. We're going to see people whose names we do not know, who are going to step to the fore, men of genius and courage and women of genius and courage, and the discredited voices of the past will fade. I won't mention two names, but I saw two prominent people in the Clinton administration which I voted for, so I'm not picking on him, I'm a lifelong Democrat, and they said we don't want to do anything that would upset the careful work that we've done the last 10 years. And I thought to myself, Lockerbie, the destruction of the Americans in Saudi Arabia, the destruction of the embassies in Africa, the USS Cole, the Marine barracks. Each time we either heard bravado, threats, or a cruise missile. And they gave us the situation that we're in today because they took a great power that traditionally had an overwhelming military power, and they allowed people to think that it was weak. And so they're going to fade into the past, and we're going to start to see people come forward in the same situation that we did after similar disasters. After Pearl Harbor, U.S. naval operations were in different hands. After the disaster at the Kaiserine Pass in 1942, a man named Patton came forward. The other people went to the rear because their time was over with. Let me finish by saying we're going to see the same revolution in culture in this country. I think we're at the end of a 20-year stupor of what I would call the triumph of the therapeutic culture. Grief counselors, yellow ribbons, and the like are not going to get us out of this crisis. So when we hear people advocating these avenues of resistance, I think they're going to fade. And I think people in the media, people in academia are going to lose credibility, and we have new people who will replace them. We have a Secretary of Defense, we have an Assistant Secretary of Defense who sounds brilliant. We have people in the State Department, we have people, I've just listened to Fuad Ajami, brilliant man, who are advocating things that we haven't heard in this country for 20 years. Not radical at all, but common sense. You know, we have a strange culture of self-loathing. I was reminded, there was a news report that said that Harvard University accepted money for scholarships and Middle Eastern studies from the bin Laden family. I don't know if that's true or not. But I thought to myself, if that were true, how odd that Harvard University would accept money from a person's family who may have been under suspicion for years of terrorism, and Yale University would reject money for the promotion of Western culture. We have a very strange dichotomy where we're almost infected with self-loathing, and yet, as I tried to point out in the book, the real danger is not that we're weak, that we're powerful beyond our wildest imaginations. We have to exercise that with care. Final comment is that we're going to see, just as we do domestically with our cultural leaders and our military leaders and New Guard, we're going to see a radically different situation in the world today. And these have always followed great transactions in human events such as World War II or the Civil War. I think you will see whether we like it or not, and there's historic grievances on both sides, a fundamental difference in the Middle East vis-a-vis Israel and the Palestinians. One of the things I all urge you to do is not to watch United States TV, but to watch British TV or German TV on cable, and you will see celebrations about the incineration of Americans in these countries that you will not see on American TV. You will hear stories about stewardesses who were described as having their hands behind themselves while they were tortured or killed that will not be on American TV. And I think you'll start to see that whether it's fair, whether we like it or not, there will be absolutely no support for Yasser Arafat. American people have had enough. 30 seconds of that celebration is enough. Second thing you will see is there will be a radical realignment, and the Islamic and the Arabic world will be weaker than ever, because I think you'll see closer ties with what I would call 19th century allies. And that would be people like India, the world's largest democracy, who borders Pakistan, has a secular democracy, has a lot of problems, but is an English-speaking country, and will start to forge ties with the United States. You'll probably see a much closer relationship with Russia. Until the rise of communism, we should say we had always been allied to Russia. There were strong ties. Now that it's a democracy, it will play a far larger role. In some ways, we have not taken advantage of that, and we've been a little bit unfair to the Russians, I think, the last 10 years. You'll start to see in the Eastern Mediterranean, and this is something I feel strongly about, just closer ties with Greece. And I think these idea that people in the world who are democratic and who are Western, are trying to be Western, that have an element of freedom and open markets, are going to gravitate toward the West. One last thing. I think if we do redefine what humanity means, I think we have to be prepared for some very tragic times coming ahead, but that shouldn't daunt us. I'm reminded what Don Juan said at the Battle of Lepanto, 1571. Only 3 states participated, the Papal States, Venice, and Spain. And they were outnumbered by a horrific fleet, the Ottomans, who had not only defeated them in Cyprus, but had also waged a war of terror along the coast of Italy. And after the squabbling was over and the admirals wanted to not reply or to back off, Don Juan said, "Gentlemen, the time for council is over and the time for battle is upon us." And I think he was right, and he led his fleet to a great victory. I think that'll be the same case here. Let's open it up for questions, because I know that I'd like to hear what you have to say. Yes, go ahead.
One of the definitions I've heard of terrorism is warfare against non-combatants. And I guess I don't think that's controversial. So I wonder, could you say more about the first dichotomy you talked about when you said that this is an act of war and not of terrorism? Could you say it's both?
I think, yes, it could, but I think what we're talking about is a degree of magnitude. We haven't, in the past, the United States, who has in all-out war inflicted a war of terror, whether it's Sherman or B-29s over Tokyo. But we've never seen terror on this scale because, again, it's important to remember the number of dead. It exceeds, I may be mistaken, but it seems to me the great savage day in American history was Antietam or Gettysburg, up to 18,000. We may get near that, and that, I think, classifies it as something different than just terror, magnitude. Somebody else? There's other reasons, but yes?
After the Vietnam War, the intellectuals and pseudo-intellectuals said that we should never go to war, and they would certainly never go to war unless the homeland was attacked. Now we're hearing our colleagues and others say, and that became a popular wisdom. Now we're hearing them say, we must not go to war until we know all the targets, how they're going to be attacked, what the full consequences will be, and the day that the war will end. I don't think that Socrates or your father made those demands. You seem optimistic, though, that we can maintain, in spite of this, a sustained war.
Yes, I do. I think that these words that we hear among our prior leaders, and I think this gets back to a change in the guard. I don't think in the next year you're going to hear the word predictable, measured, proportionate. The United States has never made war that was predictable, measured, or proportionate. What we did to Japan and Germany was not proportionate and it was not predictable, but the result was that we don't have people being burned up in gas chambers and we don't have people that were beheaded and killed like that happened in Nanking. So I think that we are going to get over that. It's a very good point. I will say that it's going to be difficult. I heard that, again, I don't want to mention names, that a very popular TV producer and documentary film said something to the effect that he thought that it was unfortunate this happened in New York since most of the people were against Bush and against war, and it was so sad. Another great novelist, I'm told he's great. I was listening to him, and he said, well, you know, people who are angry about this are mostly Midwesterner. That's us, what he meant. And people in New York who do the suffering are more sophisticated. But I had just seen films of, you know, New York policemen and firefighters, and they seemed, if I can use that vernacular, as mad as hell. So I think that the elite is completely out of touch with the Americans, and I think that we're going to see a new elite that tries to heal this wound that we've had in this country between academic people and the average person. There's been a divorce, and they live in a culture, whether it's a product of tenure, I don't know, but they live in a culture that's not connected with the rest of us. I've been talking to a lot of people on our farm, both farm workers and fellow farmers, and I say that after speaking at a lot of schools, I would trust their collective judgment much better than the political science department at Harvard. It's just, they live in the real world, and they have aspirations, and they're willing to do certain things that the academic and chattering class is not. Somebody else? Yes?
In the Gulf War, we stopped, or appeared to have stopped too soon. In this war, it seems to me that if we're putting land troops in the Middle East, that they're not coming home until there's been a change of government, yes. And it's not likely they'll come home until that new government is more democratic, less autocratic.
Yes, I think that privately, President Bush is telling his son that that was a mistake. I don't think publicly, for other reasons he can admit it, but I think that was the greatest single military blunder since Vietnam. Because if we do, as we talked about, redefine what consists of humanity, then it wasn't very humane to stop and allow the Imperial Guard to continue to exist, and then in the next 2 months to 3 months see the absolute slaughter of Shiites and Kurds, because we felt smug enough that we could turn off, or we worried about a coalition. The purpose of battle is victory. And I don't think that a man like Sherman or Grant or Patton would have stopped and let a butcher like that. He should have been forced to surrender on national television on his knees, hand over his ceremonial sword, and then we should have installed some government, or left chaos and gone home but destroyed his military. I think most people believe that. And I don't think that'll happen this time. I don't think this is going to be 2 weeks. I think it's going to consist of 3 to 4 years, like World War II. It won't just be military. It'll be financial, economic and cultural as well. We have to ensure that every Arab bank that has any transaction with a terrorist or account, so that will not be allowed to function in a Western environment. We have to make sure that people who hate us and want to return to the medieval world will have the chance not to use cell phones or not to use American Express cards. We'll have to have the idea that culturally we're not going to be awash in cultural relativism. All cultures, I'm afraid to say, are not equal. Makes a big qualitative difference if you live in a place where you can't vote and you live in a place where you can. We have to rediscover that, get out of this moral torpor. We're going to see militarily a sustained effort. I think it will probably start with bombing and then commando and special insurgency squads to eliminate the terrorist itself. And then I expect that we'll see the materialization of separate battle groups that will be responsible for confronting various countries, such as Libya, Syria, some places in the Middle East, as well as Iraq and Afghanistan, and they will be responsible for giving some ultimatums to those countries that they either have to shed these people, all of them, and we have evidence that they've promoted, or they're going to, those governments are cease to exist. I think you'll see that the Taliban will cease to exist in 4 years. It won't exist. I know that you think that's bravado, but I think if somebody said in 1939 to the British people, Hitler will not exist in 5 years, they would have thought him crazy. And Hitler was a far more formidable foe than the Taliban. We have to, again, remember that Western culture is very frightening at war, frightening. Yes?
Victor, do you think it's likely that casualties in our all-volunteer army are going to become politically acceptable in the near future? Because one of the main problems we've had, of course, is that it's simply virtually not allowed to have American casualties. And it's,
well, do
you think the volunteer army will go by the way and there'll be a reinstitution of a draft system?
I don't know whether that's good or not. Civic militarism, as I talked about in the book, is a hallmark of Western armies. Problem with, I don't know what we would do with a cohort between 18 and 20 that probably numbers 25 million people, how we could accommodate them. I do think that you're quite correct about the idea of casualties. It's one thing to lose 500 servicemen in Bosnia after we've lost 20 civilians. It's not after we've lost 5,000 to 7,000. And I think that's going to start to imprint on the American public that what more can a person do? After all, I'm not a physicist, but I think our physicists should come to the rank for and tell us exactly what the mass force is of those airliners with thousands of gallons of fuel when they hit these towers. I have a feeling that it's 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 kilotons. And somebody said, well, what if a terrorist had a backpack with a nuclear weapon? I think we've been there and done that. This is the same magnitude as a small nuclear device in downtown New York. We've gone there, we've crossed the Rubicon. And I think that people, and this gets back to a point that was just made, one of the surprising things is that the people, and I see them in our classes at Cal State Fresno, the people who are actually going to die in this war and are going to serve us are eager to fight. And the people who won't die are terrified. And that's been true of the United States for a long, long time. Yes, right here. Go ahead. Yeah.
You talk a lot about continuity throughout history of, I guess, Western dynamism culturally and especially militarily from the Greeks until now. Will this war, though, will there be differences to this war that we have never seen before in the way we wage it? Because Japan, even though they were Eastern, they had adopted Western practices. They met us on the battlefield. We knew where to send the carriers to. We knew where Rommel's army was. They would meet us on the battlefield in those past wars. I guess my question to you is where's the battlefield? Like where do we send the carriers to? How do we wage it?
I'm one of these traditionalists, maybe because as a training as a classicist, that I don't think there's anything new under the sun. We didn't know where the kamikazes were coming from. We didn't know their intentions. We didn't know how to stop them. It's very hard to stop a suicide person in a plane going 400 miles an hour at a carrier full of gasoline, and yet we did. We do know where the terrorists are. They're in they have aid from 30 countries, but they're primarily located in 5 or 6. And I think you will see that we can make life miserable for them and attack them and kill them. It will not happen with bombing and cruise missiles. There will have to be specialized ground forces put on there with the intent to face these people in battle and kill them. Ultimately, the essence of war is battle, and the essence of battle, I'm afraid to say, is killing, and those rules are internal and they go back to the Greeks. Ultimately, an American on the ground with a rifle is going to shoot somebody. And I don't think that that's going to change from now until the end of civilization. Yes?
Do you envision a kind of war like Vietnam? Because wasn't that a guerrilla war, and we finally
Yes, I think
gave up on
that's a very good case. That's something that American people should be prepared for, because I think that when we begin to act, there's going to be a radical reaction in the Islamic countries, and there's going to be 3 or 4 countries that will resist our demands, and that we will have to fight, and that war will be a guerrilla war. But I think there's a lot of mythologies about Vietnam as well. Tet, for example, which is a chapter in the book, great American disaster. Not really. Americans killed over 40,000 the enemy, and they lost less than 2,000. And if you look at the Battle of Hue, it was the finest moment in some ways in the history of the U.S. Marine Corps. It was a decisive, devastating victory. What made Tet a defeat was politics and the media and people in the United States that were horrified that we were supposed to win the war, and we lost 1,500 people during a truce. So I think we haven't seen the proper history even of Vietnam. If we look at Vietnam, this image of drug-ridden soldiers who were incompetent is entirely false. It was one of the finest moments of the American military, at least the soldiers. Like, you can argue with the tactical and strategic decisions that were made, but that was because we felt as a nation it was not in the long-term interest to shed blood and treasure in Southeast Asia. Whether that was true or not, I'm not sure. I am sure that the Soviet Union, whether we look at Afghanistan or Central America, was emboldened by that American failure. So I think that you will see situations exactly like you described, and we will fight as well as we did in Vietnam. But in this particular occasion, I don't think that when we start getting American casualties, at least if the war is waged decisively and overwhelmingly, we're going to have people at Fresno State say, "You people can't cross into Pakistani airspace. You're crazy. You want to start World War III." I don't think you'll have that feeling. We didn't lose 7,000, 6,000, maybe more Americans during Vietnam and the World Trade Center. It's a radical redefinition of this culture. I'm going to go on to the next question in the back. Yes.
Do you believe that liberalism was destroyed in the Western society when the planes hit the towers?
Liberalism?
Yes.
No, I think it was strengthened. The question was, do I think liberalism was... But I take that as the 19th century definition of liberalism. The idea that you're open to open discussion, free thought, open markets. The liberalism that's a product of the Scottish and French and English Enlightenment, American Enlightenment of the 18th century. No, I think that was strengthened because we did not collapse. I've been just amazed, not at what our elites say about what happened, but the images and what you hear what people are doing. New Yorkers have been very brave. They're going back to work. They're angry. They have a righteous sense of revenge. You have the population is very calm. We've had a lot in the media about attacking Muslims, but that's been very, very isolated. I mean, it gets a lot of media exposure, but given the situation, we've never had this, where we had the direct strategy of destroying the United States was to take Saudi and Egyptian nationalists with Saudi and Egyptian passports and put them in our key cities and have them under deep cover and have them emerge and kill thousands of Americans. It's not analogous to the situation in Japan at all, and yet we're a very tolerant society. I would much rather be a Muslim in the United States today than I would an American in Pakistan in 3 weeks. Yeah. Yes.
I think we all agree that what happened on Tuesday was evil. I'd like to briefly paraphrase 2 statements, public statements that were made yesterday. Have you comment on their juxtaposition?
Yes.
At the memorial service, Billy Graham said that he'd been asked thousands of times in his life what the source of evil was. He said he does not know. In another public statement, Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell agreed that the bombing in New York was the wrath of God brought down on us because of feminists, abortionists, and taking the prayer out of school.
Yes. Let me comment on the latter one. That's been much quoted, but believe me, And that's been much quoted to ridicule the idea of righteous anger. 99.9% of the American people do not think that people were vaporized in New York because we're a decadent society and it's God's will. I say that among almost everybody I know. Nobody has said that to me. And I live among some of the most fundamentalist people in my family and in that area, and none of them have said that. That some crackpot, mentally unbalanced fundamentalist who says that is to be taken as some way indicative of American society is absolutely ludicrous. As far as the nature of evil, I don't know whether we can discuss that in a classical or a Christian context, but there is a vocabulary for evil in the ancient Greek language as well as the Latin, and they did not think that it could be explained away or counseled away, that it would be with us all the time. And it's not predicated on this Freudian Marxist concept of exploitation. I heard somebody say, well, it's because the Arabs are poor and we're wealthy and we've exploited them. Bin Laden is quite wealthy. He's a millionaire. The people in the United States had a quite affluent lifestyle. People in Mexico and Africa are much poorer than people in the Arabic world, and they're not doing this. So it's not there's an intrinsic idea of evil in the world, and it grows when it's left alone. So again, it goes back to our idea of redefining humanity. Humanity is not feeling smug about yourself because you're educated and you can explain away something. It's combating evil. This idea of intellectual progress and moral progress is sometimes is erroneous. The Greeks believed that you could have intellectual progress and moral regress, as intellectuals and scholars develop the intellectual capacity to explain away behavior rather than to fear it. I think that's what we have a great problem in this country. The more intellectually progressive we get, sometimes we get morally regressive in allowing people to be killed and butchered in their sleep and not do anything about it. Yes?
A lot of the commentary is sort of saying that there is a fringe Islamic presence and then a more moderate. And I'm wondering if you think that looking in the larger historical sweep going back to the 8th century and the rise of Islam, that's not incorrect, that perhaps there's something fundamental to Islam as a culture that's going to destine it to have to clash with the West at some level or other.
I think that's a good question. I'd like to be precise in what the question meant. He did not mean that is there something innate in the Quran that's prone to violence, but is there something innate in Muslim culture that makes it antithetical to Westernism? Very different question. I think he's absolutely right, and we see that war, whether we're talking about the Battle of Poitiers, which is a chapter in the book, or Lepanto, which is also a chapter on capitalism, the Arab Muslimic world has been at war with the West in some fashion for over a millennium. There are certain elements in it that make that explicable. Open markets, the charging of interest. We in the West approach economics amorally, that we let the market decide. We don't have impediments based on what God says is right or wrong. Some countries, as we see in the Taliban and Iran, do today. We welcome progress, even though progress is quite destructive to custom and tradition. And yet, the Islamic world has always had a problem with open research. If you look at military manuals of the 15th and 16th century, or lighthouse construction in Constantinople, there were brilliant, isolated Arab mathematicians, military engineers, and every time they wrote a treatise, they had to worry about their right flank, as an Islamic fundamentalist said, they were rivaling the power of Allah, or they were thinking they were too good. And so research, because humans are brilliant all over the world, I'm not a believer in genetics by any means, but I think that the brilliance in the Arab world has never had the possibility to flourish, because if you were a great novelist, engineer, scientist, there was a greater propensity for religious fundamentalism. And that does not mean there hasn't been religious fundamentalism in the West. It just hasn't been sustained to the same degree. And you see that in the university system today in the world. It's no accident that people in the Islamic world, when they want to study science or they want to study literature, they so often will go to Cambridge or the Sorbonne or Harvard or Stanford or Yale. They don't have that same infrastructure in the Islamic world because there's some structural impediments to it. Again, we're talking about something historically, and one of the sad things in American culture is that We have a lot of half-educated people awash in moral relativism who says you can't make any distinction. Every religion is identical. Every culture is identical. I think if you want to look for strong family culture, Islam is superior to the West. It promotes that. It promotes conservatism, stasis, long traditions, and that's admirable. But if you want to wage a war and you want to be a dynamic society, a heartless society, amoral in the sense that it's not the way to do it. Yes?
Was the timidity of the Persian Gulf Coalition due to economic concerns? And if it was, are those conditions any different now than they were then?
I don't know what the timidity, I think it was a mixture of worried about the Arab coalition would fall apart. The Israeli question was also prominent, and there was a question of perhaps a spike in oil prices. But I think the big problem was the United States administration. I think that President Bush and his advisors easily could have gone to Baghdad, and American people would have accepted that. As far as the economic implications of the present situation, I would think that we would see a spike in oil prices in the next few years. And once again, it might not be all bad, because we have men and women of genius in this country who've been arguing for alternate sources of energy and who have the ability to do it, but it hasn't been economically viable. I think it will be very prominent, because now it'll be a question of national security. I think you will also see that should that happen, the cutoff of billions of dollars in the Arab world will hurt the Arab world much more than will hurt the West. West has ways of creating capital other than importing oil. We can survive. I don't think that I think a country like Saudi Arabia, if it did not export oil, would fall tomorrow. It would revert to the situation you see in Afghanistan, where in a matter of 24 months the Taliban ruined the entire economy, ruined the culture, imprisoned women who were doctors, and took it back to the medieval dark ages. We have somebody hasn't, yes, back there.
Yeah. Your dad and I were in the same war in World War II, and we saw 100,000 of our Japanese friends get interned in, as you would say, concentration camps or internment camps. 80% of those Japanese were citizens of this country, and not one case of sabotage was ever revealed. And yet 7,500 of their children went to fight in Europe, and their regiment became the most decorated regiment in the history of the U.S. Army. Now, you've got 15,000 Muslims between Bakersfield and Modesto, where 80% of them are citizens of their own country, like Palestine, Jordan, Iraq, etc. And they are loyal to those countries. Tell me, what keeps those people from not being interned? Of course, it took 6 months for the Japanese to get put into the internment camps. But there is a undercurrent. As soon as the mourning and the sorrows and the tears dry, I think you're going to have a fit of anger.
No, we already have the fit of anger. I think all of us in this room and nationwide realize that one of the great stains on America was the internment of the Japanese, who were some of our best fighters in Europe, and we don't even have to qualify that. American citizens, that was illegal, and Governor Warren and President Roosevelt should be ashamed of themselves for that. And I think some of the papers in the Valley promoted that, and they've never come to terms. Some of our prominent people have never come to terms who were responsible for that. And that's one thing I'd like to see, by the way, that prominent people in this community and people in the media who promoted that travesty have never come forward and accepted guilt for it, and they should have. As far as the Muslims, one thing I might disagree with you is that most Muslims that are in the United States who are not U.S. citizens are here because they have an opportunity at secular education and a freedom that's not possible. So, but their very presence here suggests to me in most cases that they have real differences with their own country. Somebody who's coming from Iraq or Syria or Palestine would not come to the United States if they didn't see opportunity. That doesn't mean that that bin Laden's cells won't exist, but I have faith. I don't think that we need to change our Constitution or even intern anybody. I have faith that the problem was a failure in intelligence. And I think that we're going to get back to that idea that a prior guard will be discredited, we'll have investigations, and we will have a renewed idea of what intelligence is that will function without interring people. I don't think that's going to be necessary at all. I don't think that we're going to see any, I know we won't see any acts of terror by U.S. citizens in this particular context, but I don't see that as the problem. I see a greater problem in the complacency and the therapeutic culture in America that will say something, as I heard on the news, well, you know, 41,000 people are killed every year in traffic accidents. I've already heard that on national news. And I've already read in the Fresno Bee that there's no reason that we have to be primitive and lash out. And I thought to myself, so that's what people did on December 8th. They gave this person the freedom to write that. They lashed out quite like a Neanderthal. So, another question. Yes?
This goes back to earlier question. You were making a difference between the Quran and saying there's nothing innate to it, and then you said it's really Muslim society. But in many ways, isn't Muslim society, particularly the more fanatical sect, founded on the Quran? And isn't there, since we're always having problems in that area of the world, isn't to a great extent because they're all Muslims and it's ultimately the Quran, there's something in it that makes them so bellicose?
That's a very controversial statement. We have to remember a couple of things, that there's millions of Muslims who are not Arabic, and there's millions of Arabic peoples who are not Muslims. So that, but in this case, it's quite correct to say Arabic Muslim fundamentalist. That's the people we are at war with. Is there something in the Quran? Well, as someone who studied something in about the Inquisition, which doesn't pale to some things that happen, and also the repression, Salem witch burnings, there's elements in all religions that can be twisted. I will say, though, militarily, as a military historian, that Christianity had a great problem in the 3rd through 7th century with this idea of jus in bello, or justice in war, that Christianity at its first inception was always felt to be antithetical to war. Great historians have written about the Roman Empire as the story of Christianity undermining civic militarism. And there is a moral, qualitative, military difference, after all, in the siege of Constantinople in 1453, when Christian soldiers were asking for penance to kill people, and people on the other side of the walls were being promised all sorts of rewards for killing Christians. That's just from a military point of view. But that's been a problem with Christianity in its inception. It's sort of gone, that it was a pacifistic. The Sermon on the Mount is incompatible with civic militarism. And I think at its very inception, the Quran didn't have a problem with that. What are the lasting effects of that? I'm not sure. Somebody who hasn't asked a question yet, back in the back. Yes?
You talked about the way we won some of the battles in Vietnam militarily, but lost them in the public imagination due to the media and so on. And I wanted to ask you to reflect a little bit about a kind of inarticulateness in our public life and inability to express our finest ideas. When you look at what Churchill and Roosevelt had to say that motivated people to keep going in the dark days of World War II, there seems to be a vast gulf between that kind of eloquence and what we've been offered recently.
I think you're absolutely right, and the question is, where is the eloquence? Where are people like Churchill waking up and saying, what kind of people do they think we are? Or where is Leonidas at Thermopylae when he was facing 250,000 Persians and he had less than 700 Greeks? They asked him to surrender his arms. He said, take them. Or as I said, Don Juan at Lepanto saying very quietly in his polite, almost like a dandy, the time for counsel is over and the time for fighting is upon us. Or George Patton, la audace, toujours la audace, encore la audace. Audacity, more audacity, still always more audacity. Where are these people who rise to the fore? The problem you identified is absolutely right. We have an educational system that does not put an emphasis on the classical sources of eloquence. And what are they? Literature, history, philosophy, languages based on the old idea of a classical tripos of rhetoric, dialectic, philosophy. We have too much, again, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but therapeutic education that teaches our children how to think they have self-esteem without giving them the tools to earn self-esteem. And the result of that is, today you can get a degree from Yale or Harvard, as the two candidates in the last presidential election both had, and not be eloquent. I don't think that was true necessarily. So we need eloquence. And we're going to, that's what I was trying to emphasize, that Sherman, whether he said war is hell, you asked for war, not me, I'm giving it to you on my terms, not yours. We need people to stand up and speak forcefully and draw on the very rich tradition of Homer and Sophocles and Dante and Shakespeare. But whether we have our elites today that have been trained in that, it's very important. Remember, Napoleon said the psychological or the spiritual to the material is 3 to 1. We had a man of eloquence of Churchill. We saw John Major in the Gulf War, but we've especially seen Tony Blair be a little bit more eloquent than our own president. I'm worried about that. I'm not being sarcastic. I think our own president has some virtues in the public arena by projecting, you know, sort of a down-home empathy that works sometimes. Eloquence is not his forte, but there will be other people, I hope. There'll be generals who will come to the fore, I hope.
About Abraham Lincoln, about what his speeches, they
Yes, well, Abraham Lincoln is the great eloquent rhetorician in the history of... That's what I meant. When the Civil War started, there were people who were comparing Abraham Lincoln in the North to a primate in cartoons and editorials. And yet, it turned out that the man, one of the things in the Civil War, they thought that Jefferson Davis, who had served as Secretary of War, was quite well educated, was a great thinker. Well, as the war grew on, it turned out that he lived in a mythical world of unreality, and he had this crazy idea of Southern bravery would triumph. And Lincoln, it turned out, was not only a great rhetorician, he was a very good strategist as well. And I think you're going to start to see these myths disappear. In the Civil War, we learned that men from Michigan and Illinois and Ohio that marched with Sherman into the South were far more terrifying soldiers than Southern cavaliers. Yes, I think we're going to learn that whether we like it or not, there's going to be men in the 101st or 82nd or whatever group they are that are eloquent, and they're going to lead men into battle. And we're going to have a radical shift in America. It's going to disturb a lot of people. We're going to have a cultural shift in this country I think that we haven't seen. Back in the back, go ahead.
What part do you think that politics is going to play in this war that's to come? And will our political interaction with the rest of the world change? Will it evolve?
Yes. The question is, what the role of politics? Well, right now, politics, remember the Greek word of the polis, or it's going to reflect public opinion. And the latest poll I saw this morning was 80% of Americans supported violent reaction. So our politicians will reflect that consensus. Politically, we've crossed the Rubicon, and we're going to make the world into a medieval world of black and white, I'm afraid. We're going to ask countries, are you with us, or are you against us? And it's time that we Americans realize that there's people in the world that hate us, not for something our elites tell us that we've done, but for who we are. If I lived in a medieval world that didn't want women to vote, and I didn't want technology to disrupt family structure, then I would hate some place like America, where women bare their navels and men dye their hair, people talk back to their parents, there's pornography. I would hate that world, even as I was fascinated with it. And that dichotomy of self-fascination and desire coupled with guilt is what plagues the Arab world and the Muslim world in general. And I think we're going to see a great dichotomy. We're going to have politicians and diplomats who are going to say to Pakistan, there's no more support and then deny, support and then deny. You're either with us or not, and you're going to learn the power of the United States military. Now, whether the American people are going to sustain that, I don't know, because there'll be a cultural backlash in this country, but I think it will not prevail. Yes,
There's two men back here that have been raising their hand.
I got person in the red, Greg.
If you do see a cultural shift coming, how do you see that playing out in the universities? Because I don't see it coming from the professoriate. Do you see it coming from students?
That's a very good point. The question is, how will that cultural shift, as it crystallizes about this conflict, affect the university? And you're absolutely right. I don't think it will change the hearts and minds of professors, but it will change students, and it will change the public perception, and they will feel that. One of the fascinating phenomena of the last 10 years, I don't know if we in the public realize it, is that my generation that came of age during the Vietnam War is now entrenched in the university as full professors, administrators, and they're very angry because they say that the new generation, 18 to 30, does not listen to them and does not like to be hectored. Well, the new generation says we have to work. We don't have free tuition. We need, this world is competitive, and they have a different life that they have to confront, and they don't really have anything in common with my generation, which is terrible for us because we're a narcissistic, youthful generation. And so this new generation, I think, has repudiated not only the ethos, but also the ideology of my generation. I see it not from so much what the students say, but what the professors say. This changing of generation is fascinating. There was a generation in Athens, the Aeschylean marathon men, Aristophanes called them, the men that stopped the Persians at Marathon. And that gave way to a majestic generation of the Periclean, and then it was destroyed in the third generation by the generation of Alcibiades. Whether we like it or not, that's my generation. Rule of thumb, as people have kidded about, when you want to see common sense, talk to somebody under 40 or over 60, because they represent, in that classical stereotype, a different generation. And I have great confidence in today's young people, much more than I have my own generation. We had some questions over here, yes?
I had several questions, comments, but I think, first of all, in reference to the gentleman that was asking about the Islam, yes. I just happened to be looking at Book TV. There was a gentleman, I'm ashamed that I forgot his name in the book, but he was on Book TV just about an hour or two ago. He was explaining that maybe you can expand on this and really differentiate between the terms fundamental Islamic fundamentalist and also the fact that he was saying that in fact these people that have done what they've done are not in a sense maybe fundamentalists, but are really politically fanatics and not really following Islam in a pure sense of the word. That
yes, I think that's a good point.
I think people are getting confused.
Yes.
Maybe you can expand that. The second point was is amazing and interesting that they were interviewing people and asking for their comments on TV, and there was this one lady that her comment was, when are we going to do something to those people over there? Kind of like it's still in this sleep that this, after what happened in this country at the World Trade Center, that she still has her mind that a conventionally or classical sense of a war that's going to take place is somewhere over there.
No, it's already
started. And that, in fact, in light of the sleeper cells and in light of the the threat of biological warfare.
Let me address those two questions. Yeah. I think you're quite right. We all, I think, one of the things I kind of tire at are people in the media ad nauseum explaining to the American people that there's a difference between fundamentalist Islam and Islam. I think Americans are already way ahead of them. They realize that. The great vast majority of Muslims, even if they are literal, have accommodated the modern world to Islam. In fact, brilliantly so. And Islam, in that regard, is no different than Christianity. But there is this group of fundamentalist Islamic nationalists who believe in a medieval world and an Islam that's literal and a Quran that's literal, and it's not compatible with either modernism or the United States or Western culture. And they're angry not because they're triumphant, they're angry because their children watch C-SPAN or when they can, or they watch they watch Gilligan's Island reruns, or they to get Jurassic Park, and they're losing control. And this is not the expression of strength and confidence, the last gasp expression. I think that's very important to keep in mind. And I think most Americans. And your other point about the war being over here, well, again, I don't know what the American people have to take. If you have something worse than Iwo Jima in downtown New York, where we're not talking about seasoned soldiers and Marines, at least my namesake was in the 6th Marine Division and knew what he was doing. And I have a wonderful letter from him from when he wrote my grandfather, and he said, you know, we don't have enough money to issue everybody a 45, and he's talking to these two Swedish grandparents who were driving around Fresno in 1942 looking for a 45 automatic. They don't have the money. He sent them $65. And they're asking him to send that back to him on the East Coast during training because it says that the guys who can have the 45 might have a better chance. Those type of people knew what they were in for. So as bad as Iwo Jima or Okinawa with 12,000, this is something different. These are people who were just going to work. They were daycare centers. And they're not going to bring them in body bags. That cloud that we see in New York is them. As horrific as that is to say, it's them. And if that doesn't shock the American people, then I don't know what will. We have time for just one more question. If somebody hasn't asked a question, I'll enter. Yes?
You say our culture is going to change because of this war. Do you see any ways that it's going to change for the worse?
Good question. Is there going to be changes for the worst? And of course, the great danger is that we've been constantly warned about, that we're going to become jingoistic and we're going to become fanatical and we're going to replicate our enemies. I don't see that as a problem. I do see that just as the United States came out of the Depression and the isolation of the 30s, we've been in sort of a cultural depression and an isolationism, or we've been immune from history. So I do think the Americans are going to change, and they're going to have to be more attuned to what goes on in the world. Whether that'll be bad or good, I don't know. But I'm not worried. I have confidence in the American people that we're not going to, as we're constantly warned, turn into some type of Western jihad. We have people of sense and sobriety that are going to guide us in the traditions of our own culture. I'm told that that's it. We've gone a little over time. I really appreciated your attendance. I just wanted to say that, again, I'm always amazed that the people of San Joaquin Valley, I don't know whether it's our location, to take geographical determinism, but I think it's mostly our cultural mix, racial mix, and the idea that we all value autonomy, independence, and hard work that makes us, I think, unique. And I thank you again for coming here. Thank you. Mainstream academic business either try to deny or apologize for. And I didn't want to write a book trying to talk about the justice or injustice of Western culture, but I simply wanted to explain why it was so. Why do Europeans today and Americans project power that's not commensurate with a rather small population and territory? Why is it that China steals secrets from us and we don't steal them from China? Why do we project power overseas and in a way that's not common elsewhere? And so I wrote this book to try to identify 8 or 9 characteristics of Western culture that, when applied to the battlefield, historically, over 2,500 years, have given the Europeans and their culture power that was not commensurate with its population. It's very unpopular because people who have seen this phenomenon try to explain it in different ways. And I expect probably to be severely criticized for this view that it was a unique cultural tradition that explains that dynamism. There's a very popular explanation that says it's guns, germs, and steel, as if it was an accident of history that Europe became so prominent. But my gosh, Mycenaean Greece was not a powerful culture. And yet, a mere 500 years later, people who spoke the same language, who lived in the same environment, projected power all over the Mediterranean. The pharaohs of Egypt were not able to project power over the Mediterranean. But once, and we were told that they declined when their soil was exhausted. Yet the Ptolemaic Greeks who took over Egypt in the same soil were able to create a civilization, moving, of course, the capital from Karnak to Alexandria, that was quite dynamic. So I would argue that this phenomenon is accountable by culture, and the culture did not exist before Greece in the 7th and through 5th century, and not elsewhere. What is this culture? Freedom, of course. The Battle of Salamis, the Greeks were extremely outnumbered, appropriate given the situation that we've had in our country. So what I would like to suggest is I would shorten that synopsis from 30 minutes only maybe to 5 or 10 in the sense of how this particular book, which came out 3 weeks ago, relates to the current crisis, because I think it does. And then I would like to just go over what I would call 5 or 10 mythologies about this current crisis that I've been hearing on television and in the popular media, and try to give you a historical context that might refute those. But most importantly, I want to hear what you have to say, and then we could have a question and answer period, and I'll try to get as many people to ask questions as possible. I wrote this book because I didn't see an explanation for what I read on the page. When I had read Greek and Latin literature, or medieval literature, or Renaissance literature, a constant theme came back. The 10,000 Greeks who in 401 were mercenaries and attacked with Cyrus the Younger at the Battle of Cunaxa lost 1 person wounded. then battled themselves out of Central Asia, and they saved 3/4 of their troops. At the Battle of Marathon, the Greeks lost 192 people and killed 6,400. The biggest problem for Alexander the Great at the Battle of Gaugamela, which may have been the biggest battle in the ancient world, was getting rid of the corpses after the battle. He lost almost nobody and slew over 50,000. We talk about the medieval period being a nadir in Western culture, but in fact, other than earlier Xerxes' brief incursion, the Moors in southern Spain, some Ottoman incursion into Eastern Europe, Europe was essentially free throughout the medieval and Renaissance period, and by the 19th century, 85% of the world's surface was controlled by European forces. Now, this is something that we either try, most of us, in the main air power, and it will be overwhelmingly devastating. It always has been in the history of the world. That's why Herodotus' Mardonius said the Greeks make war in a very strange way. They bring everybody together and they annihilate each other. And that's true. Another, of course, is technology. It's not an accident that people steal arms from the West. It's not an accident that gunpowder, while it had been invented in China, was among the mandarins, was not used in a practical way. Only in the West did people try to write treatises on it, fabricate it, compete with each other, and flood the world with firearms. Why? Because we in the West have this strange amoral tradition of divorcing knowledge from religion. Somebody's always going to try to beat somebody. And when you marry that with another characteristic, capitalism, free markets, which begin in Greece, then you have the ability not only to develop new weapons, but to fabricate them beyond your wildest dreams. The Battle of Lepanto, for example, a single Western state, Venice, with a population of less than 200,000 people, could create more galleys in a single year than the Ottomans could, who had a population of 35 million and perhaps 1 million square miles of territory. In fact, the arsenal at Istanbul, and you can see it today, some of the remains, is a duplicate of the one at Venice. After the battle was over, the Westerners who had won at Lepanto simply scrapped the cannon from the Ottomans. It was substandard. And they won that battle over overwhelming odds. Another tradition is this weird idea of Western discipline. No, everywhere else in the world, and Aristotle tells us this in the Politics, people reward soldiers for killing people. They have rewards for how many kills, or how many prisoners you take, or how well you are with the sword. In the West, discipline is defined by marching in rank, keeping in time, drill, keeping your position, advancing. It might have been the greatest single-day battle in the history of civilization. And yet they killed over 60,000 Persians. If you've been to Salamis and you look at that strait, imagining those bodies, it must have been horrendous. And they lost almost no one. Why? Well, for a variety of other reasons, technology, of course, but the Greeks believed it was freedom. And Aristotle has an interesting discussion about what free people can do, and that's going to be tested in the next year or two. We're told that fanaticism is a great advantage in war, but history tells us the opposite, that free people who willingly take up arms, slow to wrath, actually last the distance. Another decisive characteristic of Western battle is something this term called civic militarism, that soldiers in the West have rights and responsibilities. You know, after the Battle of Cannae in 216 BC, that capped a 24-month period in which over 100,000 Romans were killed on the battlefield by Carthaginians. And yet, within 8 months after that battle, there were more Romans in the legions than there were Carthaginians. In other words, a Western country was able to draft people, give them rights and responsibilities, and create a bigger army than professional mercenaries. Same was true after the Battle of Midway. We were told that the United States could not fight Japan because we only had 3 carriers. By 1944, we had over 70, and Japan had less than when they started with. Civic militarism is a uniquely Western idea, and it's quite lethal when applied to the battlefield. Decisive battle, Westerners like to engage the enemy frontally. There's some Westerners, of course, who, from Francis Marion to Nathan Bedford Forrest, who haven't done that. I'm not suggesting it's always true. But we have this propensity to bring forces to a focus. And although we will fight a different type of war this time, there will be occasions when we will harness that power of infantry and
Military historian Victor Davis Hanson's new book is Carnage and Culture, which examines why Western civilizations have such successful militaries. Mr. Hanson also addresses the terrorist attack on the U.S. and discusses them in the context of the themes in his book. It's 70 minutes.
I'd like to welcome everyone. I'm Kathy Lomonsky, and I want to welcome you all to Fig Garden Bookstore. We're especially honored today to have C-SPAN's Book TV joining us in Fresno as we welcome Victor Davis Hanson back to our store. Dr. Hanson is a professor of classics at California State University, Fresno. He's been a visiting professor of classics at Stanford University and will be a visiting professor of military history at the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland in the 2002-2003 school year. He's the author and editor of 11 books and currently lives and works on his family farm near Selma. His latest book, Carnage and Culture, Landmark Battles in the Rise of Western Power, was published by Doubleday in August of 2001. Fig Garden Bookstore in Fresno welcomes Victor Davis Hanson.
Thank you. Very glad to be here. Maybe if some of the students in the back there would like to sit down over here, there's a space. You could just walk. I don't think you'll disturb me as I talk. Very happy to be here. You know, I speak a lot out of state, and I'm always reminded when I come back to the San Joaquin Valley how much better sense people have in the San Joaquin Valley than most of the universities I speak at, so it's especially a treat for me. In the past, if I've done this, I had given a synopsis of the book for 30 minutes. I don't think that's appropriate.